All right, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for coming along. My name is Andreas Golzau. I'm the director of the Brandt School of Public Policy, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to this year's Brandt Lecture. I'm pretty sure you follow the news and you follow them closely, and you probably also follow what happens in Davos. And what I found really, really remarkable this week is a speech by Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, who gave a speech 2 days ago, I think it was, that was titled Living with a Lie. And that lie, he said, is the narrative of the rules-based international order. So let me just very quickly quote, because I found it remarkable what he said. He said, "We knew the story of the international rules-based order was partially false, that the strongest would exempt themselves when convenient, that trade rules were enforced asymmetrically, and that international law was applied with varying rigor depending on the identity of the accused or the victim." So essentially what it says is the lie no longer works. We live in an era of great power rivalry. He says the strong do what they want and the weak suffer what they must. End of quote. So in short, geopolitics have taken over. So far so good. I mean, that's what we observed, and that's not really news to us. It's just someone saying it very clearly. But the trouble is, of course, that the challenge of managing the global commons won't go away. And the climate crisis is a case in point. And it is exactly those global commons were arguably the international order indeed did deliver, however incomplete that order was. Just think of the COPs, the Paris Agreement, or club, arrangements such as just energy transition partnerships. I mean, these are all examples where states came together, rallied around a common cause, agreed on goals, and started to develop a path towards, in this case, net zero. And it is also arguably the global commons where a return to brute power politics will leave the biggest mark and impact. So lots to talk about, and that's exactly why all of this makes great sense to become the theme of this year's Brandt Lecture, which is titled Climate Foreign Policy in Times of Geopolitical Disruption, Lessons Learned and Ways Forward. The Brandt Lecture is our flagship venue for discussions, for debate, for going deep on things that matter and to reflect on the big picture. We always hear and have the great opportunity to hear from eminent personalities and thought leaders who enrich our debates here at the school. And with that, it is my greatest pleasure to introduce our honorable speaker of this evening, Jennifer Morgan, a globally recognized leader with over 30 years of experience in energy policy, climate policy, diplomacy, civil society. Many, if not most, or all of you will know her as the former state secretary and special envoy for international climate action of the Federal Foreign Office of Germany. She spearheaded, just to mention some of the many things she did, the development of Germany's climate foreign policy, and she also led various delegations at international negotiations, 3 COPs, and many others. I think what's, from the perspective of many of our students who hail from the Global South, it is probably most important to mention the Loss and Damage Fund, which she was instrumental in establishing, as well as the decision to leave fossil fuels in the ground as part of a just energy transition. Prior to becoming a diplomat, Jennifer Morgan served as the executive director of Greenpeace International. She held leadership positions, senior leadership positions with the World Resource Institute, E3G, the Worldwide Fund for Nature, and others. And that's where we close the circle. She's now a senior fellow with the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, a public policy school at Tufts University. Jennifer, we're honored to have you here. The world is falling apart, but maybe you have some hope for us. The floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor, and welcome everyone. I'm incredibly honored to be here at the University of Erfurt and to have the opportunity to share my thoughts with you this evening. It has been a big week in many ways, but I want to start here in Erfurt because when I received the invitation, of course, I had to think of the history here and the history of Willy Brandt's German European diplomacy. You know, obviously, it was here that Willy Brandt appeared at that window, and he met the cheers of people yearning for a different future. And I think that moment was one of, or if not the heartbeat of Ostpolitik. And I think it was the courage to acknowledge a difficult reality in order to change it that really struck me. And I think we're now here in a similar moment of gravity. I think we're in a way living through a global 1989. Um, when the wall fell, it signaled the end of a world that was divided by the Iron Curtain and the birth of an international rules based world where multilateralism is respected. But today, these certainties, they're shattering. And we're at this hinge point where, you know, what worked before doesn't necessarily work anymore. And I think we're moving into a new epoch, and we've got to be honest. You know, we don't yet know how it's going to turn out. So I think evenings like this to think together are really important because it's a moment that feels fundamentally unmoored. The certainties of the last 30 years, stable trade, a predictable transatlantic alliance, a shared rules-based order, and a climate that seemed maybe a little bit controllable, well, they've all been replaced by a massive time of disruption. But as Willy Brandt said in his Nobel speech in 1971, the uncertainty of the present time must not be permitted to make us uncertain too. So the other piece, therefore, is in these moments, I think of this profound disruption, there is a space that opens. You learn this at Greenpeace. Disruption is a moment for transformative change. Everything's a bit on its head. And I think that Brandt's Ostpolitik, well, it was not born in a time of comfort, but it was in the midst of the frost of the Cold War. It was a strategy for a world in flux. So, as we know, every disruption also carries the chance for a change for the better in it. And I think the European Union, Germany, a key player in that union, has to take the chances that lie ahead and not freeze in disbelief and shock and a bit of fear. Because the way the EU steps into this vacuum today, well, I think it will determine its role in the 21st century. And it will decide whether the EU remains a sovereign architect of its own future, providing prosperity and security for its citizens, or it becomes a mere playground for the ambitions of others. And it is in this context that I join you today to discuss climate foreign policy in times of geopolitical disruption. You know, the climate issue started many years ago and continues to be a topic of scientific interest and study. And that science through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the National Academy of Sciences around the world, well, it's informed decision makers so that they could move forward, often led by environmental ministries and organizations. And it's, of course, an environmental issue. However, partially due to the fact that the impacts are happening so much faster than when I read my first IPCC report back in the mid-1990s to now, and the tectonic plates that are shifting in the geopolitics of energy, I think it's clear that we have to think this issue much more broadly. And if I understand, I'm in an interdisciplinary place, so this is the place to be. Because I think, you know, the sometimes surprising and even uncomfortable truth is that climate change is not only an environmental issue, it is the ultimate foreign policy issue of our time. It's the biggest security challenge of our time, the long-term security challenge. Just a few examples to see how it's changing our world. This past summer alone, the season of extreme heat and drought and unprecedented floods cost the European economy an estimated 43 billion euros in short-term losses. This isn't projected future costs. This is today's reality. And by 2050, if we look ahead, an additional 78 million people in Africa are projected to face chronic hunger due to climate change impacts. How are they going to survive? Where are they going to go? On another side, you have for the first time on record, solar and wind power are generating more electricity worldwide than coal, shifting economics and geopolitics. And in 2024, the sales and investment in China's clean energy sectors surpassed 10% of China's total GDP. And in 2023, 40% of GDP growth in China came from growth in the clean energy sector. So this duality, the escalating catastrophe, coupled with the accelerating economic transformation, disruptions, and opportunities. That's why the last government that I was, German government that I was a part of, we decided to try something different and treat climate really as a foreign policy issue. And to make it part of the operating system of modern foreign and economic policy. It's why when that government came in, it chose to integrate climate into the federal foreign office, move the negotiations there out of the environment minister, add a third state secretary, who is also special envoy for international climate action. And for me, it was obviously the honor of a lifetime serving Germany in that role for Minister Baerbock. We designed and we did strategies as rapidly as we could. You know, the world moves fast. It did then, it's moving even faster now. And, you know, as soon as I came into office, February 22nd had happened, the beginning of the Russian war of aggression on Ukraine. And suddenly you had Germany and Europe facing a major energy crisis while having just started a new government, which climate was a priority. So my lecture today and the propositions I'm going to put forward are based on the lessons that I took from that time where I learned a tremendous amount. But it's placed in our current context, which is one of great disruption. And I felt, you know, being here that to understand where we're going and find solutions, I wanted to take a look at the blueprint left by the man after whom this school is named. So I took a look at the Brandt Commission published North-South, a program for survival. You know, he was the first to draw the Brandt line, virtually codifying the economic chasm between the wealthy North and the developing South. And one of his core messages, at least that I heard, was one of interdependence, that the prosperity of the North was inextricably linked to the development of the South. And he argued that we are an interlocking, interactive system of people, ecosystems, and resources. And today, I think understanding that, the balance of power, how Europe has worked with developing countries in the past, how it needs to work with developing countries now, I think that all needs to be internalized, it needs to be updated to create a prosperous, stable, and secure world. One thing that I learned when I was at the Foreign Office is just the importance of thinking many things together. You know, if you get into a government, you see the different ministries and even the different divisions in these ministries and the silos. You know, I don't know how it is here, but, you know, it's easy to get into your silos. But I think, you know, we can't afford to think that way anymore because energy, economic, and climate security, I think they are a single urgent security triad. Energy dependency today, well, it's used more and more as a weapon. You know, we've seen the age of petrostates leave us fundamentally vulnerable, depending on oil and gas from countries that don't share our values. We experienced what our dependence on Russia meant for us, and I think the recent actions by the Trump administration show readiness to use force, readiness to use economic threats to secure its own energy dominance, a stated goal. You know, and just the fragility of it all. Back in June 2025, the US strikes on Iranian territory prompted Iran's parliament to consider closing the Strait of Hormuz, where many people don't think about this strait, but 20%, right, of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas transits through that daily. And a closure would have just severed an artery from today to tomorrow, cutting off exports from the Gulf. And luckily, this did not occur, but it just demonstrates the fragility, how one country can then impact all of us. And the EU now is really caught in a dependency trap, you know, with the United States, because in late 2025, the US became the largest partner for EU LNG imports, share of almost 60% coming from the US. And I think this is a very dangerous time to be so dependent on President Trump for our energy needs. At the same time of that, it's obvious in a moment where we are right now that the economic security, economic stability is a top priority for all governments. And it's central. Obviously, it's the driver of domestic politics and policy around the world, and the social aspects of not only climate but just how we're working together, I think, are key. From Brussels to Brasilia, the primary mandate of governments has narrowed to a singular focus to securing large-scale industrial investment, protecting and creating high-value jobs at home, and to ensure, of course, the affordability of daily life. So these geopolitical strategies that we're discussing, be it de-risking from autocratic supply chains or forging new green corridors, they're not merely just domestic exercise. They have to and are essential, I think, to create economic stability at home. And finally, after energy security, economic security, climate security, briefly on this, the German national security strategy, which was done by the last government but is still, I think, being reviewed by the current government, had 3 pillars. It had robust, resilient, sustainable. And the sustainability chapter, well, it was new in this security strategy. As much of historic foreign policy been really focused or security on traditional definition of security. But we decided that that wasn't fit for purpose anymore in a modern foreign policy, that there's a number of risks, not only, but including climate, that require attention. So that's why the German Federal Foreign Office and the German Federal Ministry of Defense commissioned the Federal Intelligence Agency Service, the BND, a top military academy in Germany, Metis, and the Institute for Climate Impact Research picked to assess these risks. And they found that climate change was one of the top 5 risks facing Germany, which surprised a lot of people. We released this last year at the Munich Security Conference. But whether it's the critical infrastructure vulnerability from heat stress and coastal flooding, or the increased conflicts, particularly in fragile states, over water and fertile land, and shifting international order due to the global race for clean and green technology, minerals, and supply chains, it was clear it's not just soft security, this is core stability. So what are we going to do? You asked. Give us some hope. So I have 4 propositions that I want to put out for you of what I think, if I were now, in government or working with others, what I would work to do. And I think I draw from the climate foreign policy on this, but clearly it's both to catalyze greater emissions from other countries and create prosperity for Germany. I haven't talked a lot about the need for the deep emission reductions that we need in order to stabilize the climate. But obviously, that's a key goal of any climate foreign policy. I think our first priority has to be to de-risk from the United States and become more independent. And I think this, it's actually, for me as a born American, a rather difficult thing to say, but I think we have to face the situation head on, and we have to name it, and we have to move forward. Mark Carney named it in a certain way. I think going into the energy piece, and unfortunately, Mr. Carney did not mention climate change in his speech, which I found astounding. But his national decisions recently demonstrate that's not where his head is, even though I was in Canada this summer. I couldn't go hiking because of the fires. I mean, that's a privileged problem to have. But if you look at what the Trump administration is doing, we have tactics of coercion, and they are increasing. They're unacceptable. I don't need to tell you, looking at what the threats against the NATO ally have been in Greenland, the capture of President Maduro in Venezuela, and readiness to do that. The focus on oil at any cost really shows that for him, at least, international law is no longer a constraint for Washington. Then you have things specifically for the EU that are very much at bringing a great risk. The trade agreement that was agreed last summer Basically, part of that agreement, the EU pledged to purchase a total of $750 billion worth of energy from the United States, and a lot of that being LNG. This number does not make any sense, right? Either from the perspective of how much the European Union could actually absolve, or if you happen to have a goal to be climate net zero by 2050, it doesn't fit. But you can see as a tactic and part of this trade deal, this is what came forward. And a little bit less known is a current push by the US and Qatar for the EU to roll back its methane regulations, because it would mean that in the United States, they would have to reduce their methane emissions in order to import into the EU. So they've asked them to repeal the law. So I just think it's really clear we have to double down to ensure our energy supply is beyond the reach of unilateral American pressure. But that doesn't mean we close all doors to the US. Of course not. I'm talking about de-risking, not decoupling. And I think that while Europe should continue to work with the federal administration however it can, I think even greater effort is needed to be moving towards subnational actors, and that the cities and the states. There's an initiative called America is Still In. It's a coalition. It was formed actually the first time that President Trump pulled the US out of the Paris Agreement. It's a coalition of states and cities calling for climate action. It represents over 160 million Americans and nearly $10 trillion in GDP. So it makes it, in a way, as a subnational America, the world's third largest economy dedicated to the Paris goals. Many ready partners for work. And there's already a number of good examples or interesting examples. Germany recently signed a joint declaration of intent with lots of work in the past with California, of course, very important, but with South Carolina. South Carolina, it's focused on energy resilience, automotive sustainability, and life sciences, a very red state for those of you who follow US politics. But it was very interested in focusing on how to accelerate its sustainable energy, how it can be meeting the standards of the European Union because of a major export there. Many German companies in South Carolina looking to build the workforce. And so it's a partnership. Also, cities are really driving change. And that's another place where I think I see more and more activity coming together. For example, the Los Angeles, Long Beach, Shanghai Green Shipping Corridor. It's achieved 100% shore power capability in the port as late as 2025. So that's forcing global shipping to decarbonize regardless of what Washington says. So how to proceed with the US? Well, find the common interests where you can, identify the common goals, and then create new collaboration that benefits both while de-risking from the United States federally on energy. Second proposition, we need to refocus our gaze. We need to look east and south. And I think to de-risk from the US federal government, but also just generally, even before the Trump administration came in, is something that I tried to work very hard on, was to recognize that the energy, economic, and climate architecture are actually being built in Asia, Africa, and South America. And so we need to look not as far west, transatlantic, we're all very understandably focused there, but China. I mean, China, I know this is obvious, but it's no longer the maker of cheap stuff, right? I mean, it's an industrial titan. It's one with tremendous influence over our broad security. 1 in 5 EVs now are made globally, produced in, or are Chinese. China's managed over the years to become the leading refiner of 19 out of 20 strategic minerals. And it's been ready to use this dominance, as a tactic against US tariffs through export controls, which of course impacted Europe as well. It's also, of course, a critical trade partner for the EU. And last but not least, it's the largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. And China's future development path and their path to decarbonization is really going to determine whether Europe, but I would say as important, if not more important, small island nations, poor countries around the world, whether the world has any chance to avoid the impacts from a rise of 1.5 degrees to 2 degrees Celsius and avoid these irreversible tipping points and the tremendous costs. Therefore, it's in Europe's, of course, national interest that China quickly and at scale reduces its emissions. Everyone's focused on trade, everyone's focused on investment, everyone's focused on this. No, here's this big thing in the room that we need to own, because if we don't find ways of accelerating the emission reduction in China, we will have problems. And China is acting. I think years ago in Washington, actually, I ran a program at WRI, World Resources Institute, was called China Facts. It was American experts publishing on China to kind of say, this is what China is doing. Get ready, people. But it's not enough. I think we need a pragmatic and ambitious deal with China that brings energy security, economic security, and climate security together. The EU offers a stable investment and trade relationship while we ensure our Standort Europe, that it stays competitive, in exchange for supply guarantees for critical minerals, no shutting off the critical minerals that are needed, and security measures to prevent Chinese control of European data. And in exchange, well, China has to commit to such security measures, fair access to Chinese markets, and significant measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. For example, a real phase out of coal, a phase out of those methane emissions. So I think this, with along other measures, could promote investment in Germany and Europe, and how we can protect jobs here at home, create investment and security around the world. But, we have to look south beyond China, obviously, and to some of the other BRICS countries. You all know BRICS countries, the 11 nations. I think they would best be now described as the primary geopolitical and geoeconomic counterbalance to the Western-led G7. Well, it's grown in power and influence and represents nearly 40% of global GDP and almost 50% of the world's population, right? So we need to, and I think this is also one of those shifts of how you see the world. Because I was recently at COP30 in Belém, and you could see it was a Brazilian COP. And we can talk maybe about this a little bit in the Q&A, but it was clearly a Brazilian BRICS COP. The interests of those countries, Europe was not in the driver's seat at all. And so I think finding ways to work with a subset of those countries, they are called basic in the negotiations, Brazil, South Africa, India, and China, countries that share many of our values, that respect those international rules and norms. I'm not ready to give up on those yet. I think is really important, and that there can be co-benefits for all, on creating prosperity, jobs, and opportunity. What do I mean? So let's get some examples on the table. First of all, let's take Brazil and the steel sector, and Germany. So building on a long-term partnership, we could create a joint supply chain. It's a big discussion right now around co-manufacturing in a lot of emerging economies and even smaller developing countries, whereby Brazil would produce the green iron ore with 100% renewable energy, and they would ship that green iron ore to Germany for use in German steelmaking. That would reduce the steelmaking costs here by 15%, keep over 90% of German jobs, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and create value, local value in Brazil, which is so important right now, I can tell you, and a partnership with one of the most important economies in South America, if not the most, building on Mercosur, and a great advocate for international rules and norms. Or you could look south from here to South Africa. There's a relatively new partnership. It's the EU South Africa Clean Trade and Investment Partnership. I think that's a good blueprint for how to increase collaboration. It's about accelerating mutual cooperation to accelerate the low carbon economy. And it secures the supply chains for critical minerals, but also fosters local green industrialization. So it facilitates investment from the European Union in South African renewable energy, and creates jobs there in in exchange for sustainable access to the resources. Um, we could go on. I mean, another BRICS country, India, where the chancellor just was, I think, offers significant opportunities for partnership, whether it be de-risking from China on some of these critical minerals and solar. And I think there was some good foundation built there from Chancellor Merz's visit. I could go on. Kenya, worked so hard with Kenya, Colombia, all very many different countries that are seeking investment, see renewable energy, net zero climate action as part of their development pathway, but it's not yet equal. And so we need to find those ways together. So my observation here is that there's a number of the pieces here that you need in this new foreign policy puzzle on the table, but there's not yet a joined up strategic, proactive strategy that pulls all of these different pieces together, thinking energy security, investment, trade, and climate together, and with a mindset, if I may say, from a European perspective, that demonstrates humility vis-a-vis developing country partners, and the need to be really working on eye level, moving away from an extractivist approach into something that is much more equal. And that, I think, could become a very strong counterweight to the unilateralism of the United States. It would help us confidently phase out of fossil fuels, which would make us more energy independent. It would keep jobs and investment here. And I think the other piece is, yes, it helps on climate, but it also really would leverage Europe and all of these allies to build a strong place in the world. But proposition number 3, to get all of that, we need reform of the European Union, right? I mean, none of these shifts really, I think, are possible if we have so many different voices going out into the world. Just as an example, many years ago, I was in Beijing and I met with Chinese officials, and they had meetings with, I was then with World Resources Institute or Greenpeace, I think. They had meetings with the European Commission, with Germany, and with Denmark. And each of those had offered some kind of project or conference or something with them. And they didn't know of each other, right? So, of course, China said, I'll take that, and I'll take that, and I'll take that. Thank you very much. And what did Europe get for that? Right? Maybe some nice project stuff, but certainly not in a way that Beijing would then take Europe seriously in a global position. Now that the U.S. is where it is, that's opening up. But there are ways, and that's kind of some of the things we did in our climate foreign policy, where we would work together with member states and the Commission, country strategies. We worked with the embassies on the ground so that Germany and Denmark and France and the Commission would all work together. But I think that those that was good, but they're far from adequate for what we need right now. And I think to move from being a playground to a truly global player for the Xis and Trumps of the world, the EU has to consider at least 2 significant structural reforms. The first is really changing and resolving the dysfunctional setup where the Commission and the High Representative, kind of the equivalent of she's not a foreign minister for Europe, they currently have competing parallel visions. So you'll hear one thing, from President von der Leyen or from the Vice President. You'll hear another thing from the High Representative. And I think reforms could give the High Representative a clear hierarchical role and more direct control over the external action budget. And it would, in a way, be, the question, who you call. Who do you call when you want to talk to Europe? And this needs to be sorted. There are different ways to do it, but I think right now I can just say there's too much silo thinking and competition between the different entities in Brussels to be able to be effective. And I think the other is, which is much more longer term, is to think about the voting rules. Right now, so many issues have to be decided by consensus, which has allowed leaders like Orban from Hungary to block. I think we cannot allow the slowest ship in the convoy to determine our collective space. And so there are some proposals on the table for qualified majority voting for some issues. So I think that these types of reforms would ensure that Europe remains a global shaper and does not turn into a mere taker. Fourth, we need a new form of multilateralism. And I think, Europe is a multilateralist by necessity. Our extra EU trade accounts for 45% of our GDP. So if the global order collapses into total unilateralism, then, we lose. We lose a lot. But I think Europe is not the only country bloc that believes and is fighting for international rules and norms and multilateralism. The vast majority of other countries are as well. And if the US doesn't want to participate right now, that's its sovereign right to do so, but others can and must move forward. So I think this is a moment to come together around a new multilateralism, one that intensifies a collaborative approach, not a unilateral one. What do I mean by that? Well, I think in the place right now, if you go to, it used to be that you could go to the G20 or the G7 and you could have good conclusions on climate past years. That's over. There's not going to be any climate debates at the G7 or the G20 with Trump sitting at the table or hosting, as he will host the G20 one year and G7 the next year. So the only place really where countries come together besides the US is the Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement of 2015. And I think the Paris Agreement did create a successful model and a platform for climate action and collaboration. With results, emissions before Paris, the decade beforehand, rose 18%. Decade after Paris, about 1%. It gives an accountability program. You have transparent national plans, and you have to participate in mandatory measurement, reporting, and verification. However, it's clearly not doing enough. We know that if all of those national plans came together, that global average temperature would rise to 0.3 to 2.5 degrees Celsius. That would result in climate chaos. The last time the Earth was this warm was 3 million years ago, a time when modern human species didn't even exist. So it's clear that we have to accelerate the pace and scale of change. We need to solidify the multilateral response. And I think the annual COPs, the Conference of the Parties, they will be more important than ever. Now, I've been to all of these COPs. I've been to 30 COPs. It's a bit crazy. I know. And I am totally aware that the COPs have flaws and that there's a lot of criticism, and I have my own criticism. They haven't delivered enough. So many people have to fly there. There's too many fossil fuel lobbyists. And there do need to be reforms, and that is underway. But I strongly believe that it is an important platform that needs to be built upon to meet this moment. At COPs, countries are made accountable about what they've done or not done. Once a year, heads of state have to deal with this issue. Otherwise, they can pick and choose. But if they go to a COP and there's pressure to go to a COP, they have to deal with this issue. And they have to explain what they're doing to the world. The world's media has to go and report on it. And I don't think we can lose that focus. I think it's really important. And especially because these COPs, they're the only place in the world and moment in the world that the countries whose very existence is at risk from climate change, the small island states, have a seat at the table. And they have been very effective. We would not have a 1.5 degree goal in the Paris Agreement and many other things, a loss and damage fund, without the small island nations. So this is an issue of climate justice, that they have to be part of the discussion. And I think the other thought, having been there as a scientific in a scientific organization, leading Greenpeace, and then with the German government, I found that the COP is the best place, a good place to find new allies, to really understand the perspectives of others who have different perspectives, and to create new and effective, exciting partnerships for action. The COP, but now has to do more. And I think this is where a new multilateralism can come in. You could call it plurilateralism, you can call it mini multilateralism. I've heard different ways in the future, but the Paris Agreement has its overarching goals, and the countries are moving forward to meeting them. But the Paris Agreement also enables groups of countries to come together to meet that Paris goal and go faster than the consensus voting rules of the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC require. For example, last year at the COP in Belém, over 80 countries called for a roadmap to accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels. And another example, 9 countries, small but important, they announced support for a premium ticket levy. So a levy on private jets, first class and business class tickets for funds, because we know public funds are not very plentiful right now to go into that loss and damage fund, to go into the adaptation fund, to go into supporting climate action. And so I think this is a new multilateralism where, in the pursuit of those mutually multilaterally agreed goals, groups of countries can come together and collaborate to go beyond what consensus-based decision making would make. And it's not only for countries, that's another piece. I think it's also the COPs were non-federal actors, states and cities. Governor Newsom from California was there last year. Are there. Indigenous leaders, NGOs. We saw last year how important them having active participation was. Comes forward. I could talk for a long time about COPs. If you want to go into any depths, we can do that in the Q&A. But these 4 propositions, I think they would, create a more stable, stronger, prosperous Europe, but also not just Europe, for most countries around the world, and it would strengthen the multilateral system. So my final piece that I just want to share, and I know it's getting late, so I'll wrap up, is just to share a reflection with you, which is all of these 4 and the ability of Germany or Europe to be able to even talk to other countries about this is because of the domestic work that Germany and the EU had done to reduce emissions and also provide climate finance. And I think the justice and equity dimensions of the climate crisis, they are just massive. And when one thinks and acts globally, you always have to have this in your heart and in your mind, because the countries that are suffering the most have done nothing to cause this problem. They are suffering, and they need to see a serious commitment by industrialized countries and wealthy countries. I would not say only developed countries, but wealthy countries to act, and that's primary. And I think the reason why the European Union and Germany had impact on climate action and what other countries is doing was because of our strength of our action at home. And that enabled us and me, when I was meeting with other countries, to say, okay, let's look for solutions together, because there was credibility. And then I could try and work to bring other large emitters along. But obviously it has to be more about that. It has to be about bringing benefits to us. And domestic action brings significant benefits to Germany and Europe. And you probably are aware, I won't go into the details, I can in the Q&A, but just the benefits that have come from the energy transformation. And I think, in Europe, you've seen a reduction of greenhouse gases by 37% by 1990, and the economy at that time period has grown by about 70%. So it's, you can really have economic growth and reduce your emissions, create those jobs that are so important. The connection between our national interests and strong international climate foreign policy, I don't think they've ever been clearer. And so this recent decision of the European Union to actually continue its goal to be the first carbon neutral continent by 2050 and thus commit to reduce emissions 90% by 2040, that was in our economic, energy, and climate security interests. So in conclusion, I got to come back to Willy Brandt. He once said, peace is not everything, but without peace, everything is nothing. And in 1980, he expanded this vision to include the peace of survival. And the idea that a world divided between a wealthy, carbon-heavy North and a struggling global South was a world destined for conflict. And today, I think our data tells us that the survival program Brandt envisioned is perhaps within our reach, not through charity, but through courageous, bold, pragmatic action. The Brandt line, well, it still exists today, that's clear, but I think it's being redrawn. by the access to clean tech and critical minerals. And our task is to turn that line of division into a bridge of partnership. When we work with Brazil on green iron or South Africa on critical minerals, I think we are practicing the ultimate form of bronze interdependence. Recently, during a visit to Warsaw, I stood at the monument to the ghetto uprising, thinking of Willy Brandt's courageous and powerful gesture. And I was reminded that the leadership is the courage to kneel before the truth so that we may stand up for the future. And the truth of 2026 is that our old dependencies are our greatest weaknesses, and our new partnerships are our greatest strengths. And the truth is also, though, that in order to come out of this disruption in a positive way, I know it all seems dark, but there is light. For that future, we will need people, people with passion, and the stamina to stay with it through the ups and downs. We've been through ups and downs for many years. People who have a deep commitment to creating a climate-just world and a belief that we can create change at scale, even in these darkest moments. People ready to fight for what we know is right and not give up. And that's where we all come in, obviously, but particularly, I think, students and young leaders of today, you're so very important. And I am sure that I'm looking at many of those here today. So determination, knowledge, respect, collaboration. Let's get to work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, for an inspiring speech and for a wonderful Brandt lecture. Let's open this up for Q&A, for any questions, comments, thoughts. Let's make this a conversation. We have some time for that, and I would invite everyone to share what they have to say. Who wants to break the ice? Otherwise, I have to. If you could quickly introduce, who was first? I didn't see, maybe you were here? I don't know who was first. Then it was Jan. Can you quickly introduce yourself?
Hi. Jan Nickler, I'm here at the Brandt School as a postdoc. Thanks for this amazing talk. It was really awesome, and I basically agree with all your four propositions. Just maybe you could shine a light a little bit on how to, in a practice, do climate diplomacy with people, with governments who don't share the same values, who even don't understand that it's a problem, and if they understand, they may not, they don't care.
Yep.
And you could also say that this shifts a little bit. Think of Brazil. You have like a left-wing government, you have a right-wing government, and then how to form like these partnerships we were talking about. And then connected to this, what is then could you go to the impact of people, of non-state actors, of unions, indigenous movements in the global south, or even companies, businessmen, like the civil society. I'm afraid to say the word, but maybe the soft power part as well.
Yeah.
No one talks about this anymore.
Yeah,
so
that's true.
Nice.
Great. Yeah, great questions. So I think I gained a lot of experience on how to work with those that were not really either decided not to internalize the science or had other interests. I visited Saudi Arabia twice as state secretary. And, just as I'll give you two examples. I think in both examples, it's about finding where that player, that whether it's a country or a state or a company, where they're out and where there is a space where you can actually have a conversation, where you have something shared. You have to be willing, and this is something else I learned, if you talk about China, well, of course, at the same time, you need to be criticizing human rights, but finding that nexus. So with Saudi Arabia, they are deeply vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. They know it. They want to have the last drop of oil be Saudi that is sold, but they know they have to diversify. And so for them, they were interested in Germany for potential exports of green hydrogen. They were interested in learning from Germany because they're trying to actually build their domestic renewable energy up, which they have been doing, partially so they can export more oil and gas, of course. So it was about finding that kind of economic commonality. You know, similarly, I was in North Carolina with the lieutenant governor who is a climate denier, and many other things. And I thought, do I go meet with this guy? And I did, and I told him the story of, you know, renewables in Germany and the job creation and the training programs and everything else, and he wants to come visit, right? So it's about finding that common interest, I think, and you have to make a decision whether it's so bad that you can't do that with that country anymore. But you know, we don't really have the luxury. I mean, Russia, of course, at this moment is one of those. We're not seeking new partnerships with Russia on anything. There was lots going on before the war. But I think with all of the other countries, you can find that. But you have to listen. I mean, you have to really listen and really understand it's so basic, but understand the perspective of others. And you have to find other channels to make sure that you're clear on the other issues that are important. And that can sometimes conflict, you know. But I think you can do both. That's what I learned. You don't have to not work with China because of human rights violations. You can call them out. Minister Baerbock did call them out on human rights and work with them on climate at the same time. I don't think I could understate the impact of people and civil society and indigenous peoples, because I think we would not be where we are today with the Paris Agreement if it weren't for them. They play many different roles. They play roles, and often it's not seen, and so therefore it's not necessarily recognized, and therefore it may not get funded, which is a problem, right? But whether it be the think tanks that are doing the, you know, answering the questions, the policy level work that are there, whether it be you know, explaining what's happening. This is more in the negotiations, but to the world, because nobody understands what's going on at a COP, and working that. Whether, though, it be even more fundamentally, I think, organizing on the ground, because when I said people are the center, I mean we can't go anywhere without people, at least in democracies, right? So I think the groups that are working to meet people where they're at, listen to what their concerns are, and then find solutions to do that, whether it is something that local groups are very important. Indigenous peoples, I mean, they are in a way the guardians, right? And so when it was quite amazing in Belém, you know, they came in force. And I think keeping that type of participation in a COP, but then also through national and local decision making is essential. I mean, business as well. I mean, business is a, you know, multifaceted animal. And I just did a piece for Table Media about the U.S. fossil fuel interests. So, you know, if you need to understand why the U.S. is doing what it's doing, you just need to look at the numbers of all what's been funded by the fossil fuel industry forever. But there are now, I would say, many companies, and I think here in Germany, I'll just speak from a German perspective, having the voices of the Mittelstand, the small, medium-sized enterprises, the others who are actually leaders in this field more in our national debate, would be really helpful, because they are charting the future. So I would recommend that, you know, every country that has the ability to have both formal consultation processes with all these different actors. Labor, I think, is also fundamental. I think that the climate movement got a bit ahead of the social issues, or behind rather. And so thinking the social and the climate together, and working with labor, and ensuring that there's just transition, is more, that their importance, I think, has just been risen.
Thank you. Your chance. I think I have the back. Here we go. Right, I guess you're next. Yeah.
So Lucas, I graduated from the public policy program a decade ago. And and the SMEs, the Mittelstand. So I'd like to dig into that point, listening to the voices of the Mittelstand, and these voices are frightened.
Yeah.
They stand and with their back at the wall right now, and that's what I hear every day. Yesterday I was visiting a small company, just 20 employees. Okay, fairly, I have to say, I entered there. I thought I'm back in the New York Times the moment I entered that building. Okay, so that maybe they didn't do that homework well. But the director and the CEO of that, the Geschäftsführer of that place, he was desperate. He said, by the mid of this year, if nothing changes, I'm gonna get out. That's it. It's over. Either sell the place or just close it down and then 20 people on the street. And well, you mentioned, well, yes, Germany, EU and Germany had impact on other countries because they had impact at home. Emphasis had past tense. We clearly already did. Okay, I'm a conservative and I'm not very happy with what the Greens have done to our country, but that's my personal opinion. But the it's a rift. The deindustrialization is happening right now here, and we are becoming like the UK. And I don't want us to become like the UK in that sense, because they're hard. Maybe they're producing a few turbines and engines for Airbus and Rolls-Royce, but that's practically it. And otherwise, they administer NGOs, and what do they do? Ask the developing world what they think of them. So what? And you just said that the 90% goal CO2 emissions by 2040 was not in our economic and global geopolitical interest. So what should we do now? I mean, we're just destroying our economy and we're losing exactly that credibility and that we have had. So I think we clearly overdid it. So what's the path? Because if we destroy our economy here, we're still number 3, but not for long anymore. Then who's the voice for reason, and who are the ones who can actually bring clean energy to the planet? Who's going to step up? Frankly, I don't see anybody there.
Great questions. And I think it's not over yet. I think that Germany and the EU still has that influence. I'll just clarify that for that perspective. But let me try and share some thoughts, because I think this is a hugely important discussion. And what's the path? And there's different pieces. So my view is, if you look at the costs, to start just from the economic future, if you look at the costs of climate impacts and you look at the global situation with China is eating our lunch, right? Who's going to do it? China is doing it, right? There's no going back on that, right? So if you look at that and you understand the climate issue, you understand that you have to decarbonize, right? Then how you do that in a way that is socially acceptable and creates those opportunities, I think is obviously central. And my sense is that there are parts of the German economy that have benefited from that, and there are parts of the German economy that have not yet. And some of it is due to higher energy prices. Renewables have actually helped decline energy prices, and will continue to do so. Yeah, you have to look at it, but if you look at the trends, and if I look at the trends in gas prices, I don't want to be volatile on those gas prices, right? So I think we're on this pathway right now. But I think the destabilization of where are we going from the current government is not helpful. And so I think staying the course of, getting that, we have a 2045 climate law, but doing it in a way, number one, for companies where there's a couple of different pieces. I think looking at the energy costs particularly and seeing how to manage those, And I think that's not done by building a lot of new gas-fired power plants that are going to take a long time. I think it's more done by investing in the renewables that can move forward and create the jobs and the value, and having value creation through those projects, because that is also an opportunity, and there's lots of communities that have benefited from that. And then I think these types of partnerships, I mean, it depends if you're Mittelstand or if you're, we hear a lot in the media about steel and cement and chemicals, right? And that's why I've been trying to think about what is the future to keep industrial actors here, right? That's what we all want, right? But to do it in a way that is competitive with China, with India. You have the carbon border adjustment mechanism that's coming in from the EU that started, right, to get a more level playing field. But that also then creates, keeps, jobs in Germany, reduces energy prices, and creates that geopolitical partnership with an important player. That's on the steel side. I think on the small, medium-sized enterprises, particularly those that export, I think a lot more could be done actually to support those exports than is currently done by the government. And what I saw when I was in States, because I met with German business all around the world, and what I experienced was oftentimes not enough of a, Germany is obviously and will remain a market-based economy, a social market-based economy, but other countries can play a more active role in actually bringing together the actors in other countries so that German industry and all of the players along the supply chains actually have a chance. Sorry, that was a bit of a long answer, but be keen to hear your thoughts of what should happen, not happen. I think the bureaucratization is, or the Entbürokratisierung, dieses Wort liebe ich, I think is incredibly important. And that's not necessarily just a sustainability problem. I think the risk, the readiness, this is more of a cultural thing, but it's also, in the US you can start and fail and you don't lose everything. In Germany, that's different, right? And so that's also part of the equation in my mind to make to bring more investment here, but also to have more success. Because if you're risk adverse in the current geoeconomics, then you also have problems because it's too long. You're not, I mean, I can tell you, and then I'll stop. There was, at one point we were working in Brazil to try and land an agreement on some critical minerals. And by the time that the German industry and the German government had a chance to even just look at it, China had bought it. So I think we need approaches all across the board. But I think the benefits from multiple perspectives are there, and I think it would be, to not stay the course, I think would be more damaging in a way. But we have to find those solutions, and I worry about it.
Good, Marcus, and then we got, or should we maybe, no. Marcus go first, and then we got Aigul, you come third. Okay.
I promise to ask the ethics question.
Yes.
And I'd like to get your ideas about whether we are facing good times or bad times for ethical arguments. If you read the news, people could believe, well, it's now time for realpolitik, back to geopolitics, so it's about deterrence, it's about strength, it's about power, all of that. But you mentioned the speech by the Canadian Prime Minister. Yes, he hasn't mentioned climate change, but he said that we need to be sustainable, that mid-power countries need to be sustainable. And he mentioned values quite often. And talking about values is talking about ethics, it's talking about philosophy. So it might be that we were a bit hypocritical about our values. It might be that we sometimes had pretexts that sounded noble, but in the end it was about power and it was about our interests. Is it possible, in the context of climate change and perhaps in foreign policy, that we see a revival of discussions about values and how far does it carry us? I'd like to link this to a more German perspective. If people tell other people this party is not democratic, you cannot vote for this party. I'm convinced by that. That's enough. If a president is non-democratic, I cannot vote for him. If a party is non-democratic, I cannot do it. But I'm surprised that there are other people who are not convinced by this. So, what is your feeling about the future? Will we be talking more about ethical values or less?
Get the easy ones now.
Yeah. I think it's going to be more. That's my gut. And I think that because in my experience, the collaboration that I had with many, many different countries in different ways was not only because of the economic interest, right? Of course, that was a big part of it. But it was also about an understanding of what's at stake for people, the most vulnerable, for peace, for the world, for nature, for things that didn't have a dollar value on them. And, you know, I know climate obviously the best, but I think with this very clear epitomization, representation from President Trump of what the other looks like. On the one hand, yes, he is unleashing and creating permission for others to be using the type of tactics and doing the types of things that he's doing. But on the other hand, I think he is making it very clear to many people around the world that that's not who we want to be. And so I think it needs to be kind of harnessed and brought up as something that is who we are. It's about our humanity, and that we're bigger than just hard power. And I think it can. How far does it carry us? I mean, within the climate debate, I think it will be front and center because, the other thing I didn't talk much about, but the International Court of Justice case that Vanuatu brought, and was in the end a justice values case, and because the impacts are hitting so much harder, you could just say everybody will just look the other way. That is a possibility. But I think those people, those countries, and not only those, but other countries. That's why we need the UN. That's why we need the COP. Are not going to let people forget that. But I think it's up to us in a way. I think it's up to journalism to be making sure, and schools like this to be making sure that those issues don't go under. But I get a sense that there's more humanity in it now, somehow. It's more instinctual.
We'll do our best.
I'm a current MPP student, and somehow my question is also a little relevant, I think, to ethics. You talked about newer kind of approaches, looking south, east, and then you said we will partner with China, but of course we first have to call out human rights. Maybe I'm wrong, but I get the feeling that it's not a new approach, actually. It's very old school. And I think if they want a new approach, maybe they need to be practical, not call out human rights, but actually focus only on partnerships. Is that correct? Or?
I think what I meant with kind of a new China deal was to be, let me step back. My sense, and you all can correct me from your perspective, but my sense is that many in the world, in the quote West, have been asleep at the wheel in what has been happening in China, right? And on the technological side of things. I mean, 10 years, 15 years ago, China knew it was never gonna compete with the combustion engine. So it started the whole ecosystem for the electric vehicle. And you can go through like I said, on the mineral side of things. So in a way, my sense is that in Europe, and in the West, there needs to be a recognition that China is now playing a different role than it was before. It is a producer of highly technical, I mean, you can drive a Chinese EV. They're great. It used to be, oh, we want a German car. Well, no, it depends what you're looking for, but the whole entertainment experience is great. So a partnership with China, I actually called it a deal. Because for me, it's, and maybe I think for Europe to look at China and treat it as that power is different than what it's been doing in the past. I think Europe has been using China to produce many, many things, right? Cars, etc. But it hasn't necessarily seen China as a world power. And China is now in a different place. And to me, that means that you can't wish that away and just keep looking west, which is my experience of what happens in Brussels and Berlin, right? So one key point is just treat China in that way and look at how you can get all of your different interests from both sides into something that brings that kind of security. And that goes beyond, I negotiated climate transformation partnership with China, right? And we're doing pilots on this and that. That's great, but that's only this big. The relationship with Europe and China, or Germany and China, is this big. And you need to think across the entire thing. I also, though, think that as a country that has signed the Human Rights Treaty, is a member of the United Nations, that Germany and other countries need to call out others that are not following that, whether it be China or whether it be Iran or wherever it may be. And my experience is that you can do both. You can, it depends how you do it. Gosh, the first COP I, was state secretary was in Egypt. Ooh, we did a lot on human rights there. It made us incredibly unpopular, right? But we were able, because we're Germany, to work with the delegation to move things forward on the climate side of things. So I don't think it's an either or on the human rights piece. And I think it's very important that we don't give that up. Because of all of the people around the world that are suffering from such regimes. But I do think it's time that, like I said, stop just looking east or west and doing everything in order to get the US to do whatever, and start really diving into what's happening in China and find eye-level deals.
Christian, Greenpeace student as well. My question is not related to ethics, or might be as well. I've been researching on Arctic energy resilience, so I have some project.
Oh my gosh.
And I would like to know how to convey the urgent need to speed up the green transition with the increasing securitization of energy in places like the Arctic, where energy supply is a matter of life or death. Where is even voices pushing for locking in fossil fuels just to have a better sense of energy security?
I think whether it be the Arctic or parts of, developing countries that have fossil fuels that have not yet developed them, right? I think the only way that you can talk about or move forward on phasing out fossil fuels or keeping fossil fuels in the ground, as Greenland decided to do, is if there are alternative pathways for domestic growth or prosperity. So, because if there's not, then it's very challenging, I think. And in a country, I know Africa a little bit better, but I think, if you're looking at countries like a Senegal or a Congo that have gas, but also have critical minerals, also have renewables, then what we were trying to do is actually to build a different development pathway that those countries could take that would actually bring more benefits. Because fossil fuels is a trap. If you look at who benefits from, look at Venezuela. The people of Venezuela did not benefit from fossil fuels. If you look at Nigeria, they did not benefit. Even in the United States, wealthiest country, it's not like. So, but I think you have to find alternatives, and in the Arctic, it's hard. I think then you have to try and find a way of, well, I mean, Iceland in the Arctic has geothermal, so you can look and see if there are other possibilities. But if not, then you need to find a way of finding a system where those that are there's a just transition, so that you're training people out, and if it's a revenue source, that you find ways, especially of supporting lower income families that are dependent on it. Those are just some thoughts, but I'd be interested in what you're finding.
Yeah, we'll find out by the end of the term.
Yeah.
That's part of an ongoing project, and I
Okay.
guess that's a good moment in time to say, hold on. Thank you, Jennifer, for joining us today, for sharing your thoughts, for being with us, for an engaging discussion, for a great Brandt Lecture 2026. Before I hand over the mug you always wanted to have, let me invite everyone to give a hand and join me in thanking Jennifer for this great speech. Thank you. Here we go. The mug you always wanted to have, and
Yes.
some local treats. I hope you enjoyed them.
Oh, thank you very
Yeah,
much. I
there
love
you go.
orange, so I will use this. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and I wish you great success and luck in the work that you're doing. I mean, it's so important, and I look forward to reading about it.
Thank you.
Take
Thank
care.
you very much. Thank you. All right. Thanks everybody for joining. Have a lovely, lovely evening.